Hello guys and welcome back. So yesterday in our look at the Prague Spring, we got up to the moment where Dubček has introduced these reforms in Czechoslovakia. He is pioneering this kind of slogan of socialism with a human face. And we're kind of yet to see how the Soviet Union reacts. And that's where we're going to start today. So the Prague Spring represented the biggest challenge to the Soviet control of Eastern Europe since the Hungarian uprising in 1956. Hungary had been one of Khrushchev's biggest tests, and now Czechoslovakia is to be one of Brezhnev's first challenges. This is Brezhnev here. Remember, he's the leader that takes over from Khrushchev when Khrushchev leaves power in 1964. So Brezhnev needs to decide how he's going to act. Is he going to accept Dubček's reforms, or is he going to use force? Now, the way that he acts will also set a precedent for other countries to follow. So he has those same fears and worries that Khrushchev had when he's thinking about whether he acts or not. The Soviets had hoped that appointing Dubček would end these calls for reform. However, it had had the opposite effect, as Dubček had introduced wide-ranging new reforms. However, he did say that he was committed to remaining part of the Warsaw Pact. Now, the challenge that Brezhnev faced was to try to maintain Moscow's influence without making the situation worse. Other leaders from within the Warsaw Pact are very concerned by the developments. They're worried that unrest is going to spread to their own countries. For example, Poland. Remember, this is where protests first happened that inspired the Hungarian uprising in 1956. But again, students in Poland are calling now by 1968 for their own Dubček. Okay, so clearly this has inspired already other countries and groups in other countries to start demanding further reforms away from Soviet communism. Now, initially, Brezhnev resists intervening. He felt as long as communism remained in power in the country and Dubček remained committed to the Warsaw Pact, that the situation could be managed. And this is just like what happened in Hungary. Remember, initially they think it can be controlled. Khrushchev initially allows some changes. However, Dubček begins to gain support from other countries independent of the USSR. For example, independent communist Yugoslavia. I'm going to make a really short little video on Yugoslavia just to explain what happened there. But they are communist, but they're not actually aligned to the Soviet Union, and they were actually expelled from Cominform, the Communist Bureau, if you remember when we learned about that. So they're not actually aligned with the Soviet Union. So they're talking with Yugoslavia, and that's obviously going to worry Brezhnev because he's thinking, well, what if Czechoslovakia go the way of Yugoslavia and actually align with Yugoslavia instead of with us? Romania is also beginning to show support for Czechoslovakia, which is really worrying to Brezhnev because Romania is part of the Warsaw Pact. Now, if countries within the Warsaw Pact start to support Czechoslovakia, that obviously brings the risk that the Warsaw Pact might break up and the communist bloc will also break up. As Moscow had seemed to accept the reform, it encouraged Dubček to go even further, and he announced plans to remove all censorship of the press. At this point, exactly like Hungary, where things are allowed and then almost like the country goes one step too far, by this point, the members of the Warsaw Pact get very, very angry, and they call on Brezhnev to do something about this situation. So in June 1968, the Czech border is chosen as the location for the Warsaw Pact military exercises. Soviet, Polish, East German, and other countries from the Warsaw Pact's troops line up on the border as a military exercise, and it's designed to intimidate Dubček's government. So I've got all the countries here in orange that are Warsaw Pact countries. Imagine if they all just started to line up on your border with their very strong militaries. We know they have very strong militaries. In July, the Warsaw Pact then go one step further, and they actually meet without Czechoslovakia to discuss the situation. It would have threatened and it would have isolated Czechoslovakia to not have been involved in that meeting. After the meeting, they issue this, and this is what they call the Warsaw Letter. Now, this is a translated copy in English. it wouldn't have been in English, but you can access this actually on the National Archives, and I'm going to leave you a link for you to do that so you can actually have a look at it. But the letter stated that each country had a right to self-determination, but also warned that a challenge to the communist system in one country risked damaging the system as a whole. Brezhnev then went on to hold a series of meetings with Dubček to try and convince him to reverse the reforms. But Dubček doesn't listen. He's very, very committed to this idea of this new pathway for Czechoslovakia. Brezhnev saw this as evidence that the crisis had not been solved diplomatically, but that he tried, and he then brings the Warsaw Pact together and they turn to their combined military force. So on the 20th of August 1968, 20th of August 1968, Soviet forces enter Czechoslovakia and quickly seize control of Prague. 500,000 troops enter, so it's a really, really overwhelming and intimidating force. There is some civilian resistance, but Dubček orders the army not to fight back. He knows that people that resist the invaders will be dealt with brutality, and he knows that they will just be slaughtered. So he actually asks the army not to fight back. The official Soviet line on this is that they are responding to a request by the Communist Party in Czechoslovakia to restore order to the country. However, in kind of like a last act of defiance, the Czech radio stations broadcasted reports of the invasion to the world and describe it as a violation of socialist principles and international law. So the radio stations kind of broadcast the truth. So in terms of the consequences of this, 100 protesters were killed and 500 were wounded. But, you know, that is a relatively small number when you consider this was a military invasion with 500,000 troops. The Prague Spring is officially over, and a new hardline government loyal to Moscow and the Soviet communism is established in 1969 in Czechoslovakia. Dubček is arrested and forced to reverse the reforms. He's then expelled from the party and sent away. However, he wasn't put on trial and executed like Nagy was from Hungary, if you remember. And he does return to politics after the fall of the Soviet Union and is celebrated as a hero 20 years later. This is actually a plaque to him. Okay, so as always, we need to think about what Czechoslovakia shows to us. How can we use this to talk about the Cold War? So events in Czechoslovakia prove how determined the Soviet Union was to deal with opposition in order to prove its control over Eastern Europe. We're going to have a look at how the rest of the world react in a moment. You know, how does the West react? But let's just have a look for a second at these two images behind me. So we've got one cartoon picture here, you know, the Lady of Freedom being trodden on by this militaristic Brezhnev dressed in his USSR uniform with a tank behind him. And over here we have the flower sprouting that is Czechoslovakia being crushed out by the iron boot of communism. So there's an idea of how this is being seen by the world at the time, you know, the brutality of the Soviet Union coming in to crush out the life, the growth from Czechoslovakia. Now, in terms of reaction to this event, communists around the world are outraged by the Soviet Union in Czechoslovakia. And communists, especially in the West, so people that believed in communism but lived in places like the UK, England, America, see it as a betrayal of communist values and an act of imperialism. Remember, that word means creating an empire by the Soviet Union. This is actually a protest in London behind me. About Czechoslovakia. There are also protests in China and Yugoslavia, two other communist countries, and there is even a protest in the USSR in Moscow itself. This is the Red Square, which is the center of Moscow, and this is where a small and very short-lived protest happens. But you know, that is absolutely incredible that a protest in the USSR takes place against this, bearing in mind, you know, their restriction on opposition they have in the country. Now, even more concerning to Brezhnev at the time was the Red Army, so the military force of the Soviet Union. Now, they'd been told that their presence and their invasion had been requested by the Czech people. But when they arrived and realized this was a lie, many of them were very, very angry. Now, they didn't mutiny. Now, mutiny means to disband and leave, walk out of the army. But when they got home, they did start telling of this story, and talking of how they had been manipulated. It showed many countries across Eastern Europe that their governments were not revolutionaries or committed communists, but they were really only concerned about staying in power. And it did lead to lots of people losing their faith in communism. In terms of the West and the USA, the USA is quick to condemn the Soviet Union and the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia. They cancelled the new upcoming meeting between President Johnson, who has replaced Kennedy, and Brezhnev. Other Western countries also heavily criticized the Soviet action, and there are attempts at the UN to pass a resolution condemning the violence. But just like with Hungary, the USSR vetoed this attempt. Remember, if one of those countries, those permanent important countries, of which the USSR is one of them, veto, it doesn't go ahead. So just like with Hungary, the resolution, the motion is vetoed, and therefore the West take no further action. The American government is more concerned at this time with Vietnam, and the Cuban Missile Crisis meant that there was kind of a growing sense that the superpowers needed to be on better terms and avoid a nuclear situation like that in the future. So what had really happened is that with Hungary in 1956 and the lack of USA's interference, they'd kind of set themselves a precedent there that they would not interfere with things going on behind the Iron Curtain. And with Czechoslovakia, that doesn't change.